Good morning to you YouTubers. I want to start off by saying, remember how Jesus, when he was preaching, he said, pray to the Lord that he will send more workers for the harvest. And it's an interesting thought, because in these days that we're living in, we find a lot of falseness out there, a lot of false truth, and it's hard to distinguish between truth and error. What is truth? In order for a person to find truth, the first thing they must do is realize that there is a God, and then to ask the question, what must I do? There is a book called The Two Babylons by Hislop, and that takes you to the origins of all your Eastern religions as well as the Catholic Church and what they all have in common. That's very important, because today, with multiculturalism, what is bred is atheism, and what we see in the world today is atheism growing. And we see our governments lie to us. We see a police force that we do not trust. We see wars and commotions happening in the world. And it makes it very difficult to believe in things. And when truth is presented to us, it's easy to push that aside and say it's falseness because of the lies that we see all around us. But that's where study is required. A person that turns around and says, I believe, then the question is, well, what is it that you believe? A lot of people say they believe without actually researching what it is that they believe. And a lot of people do conformity. They'll belong to a religious organisation and they'll follow the dictates of that religious organisation and say, well, this is what we believe. But the question is, well, is that truth? People really want to follow, and they're not really interested in truth. Very few people are interested in truth. They just want to follow. They have what's called soothing ears. It is a real shame. I mean, the people today, they want someone to follow. The world uses basically four principles to fool the people. One is the Hegelian dialectic. Now, through the Hegelian dialectic, its principles are, for argument's sake, let's supposing you be Liberal and I be Labour. And we pretend to be opposing each other. But really, it doesn't matter who's voted in office. The direction of the country never changes. But let's supposing we want to change or direct the people in a way in which we want them to go. Well, often we'll use what's called chaos theory. And so we'll create a problem, and the whole world is looking at that problem. The plandemic or pandemic, however you choose, is a good example. And then they offer a solution. So that's one of the ways. Hegelian dialectic also includes wars. We see wars happening now. And so what they do is they create the problem and they offer the solution. Well, what could the solution be? Well, obviously, in America, we see state and church coming together. So, but is it truth? Or are we being deceived? Person needs to research. A person needs to know what they believe. They cannot just turn around and say, I believe. They've got to research. The second mode that they use is what's called 80-20. And yes, we did see that in the pandemic, or plandemic if you choose, where 80% of Australia took the jab, whereas the other 20% did not. 80-20. Right? Now, if the establishment had pushed the people even further, then what you would have is from the 20% a breaking away. So 80% of them would go back to the world, so to speak, and so you have a remaining 20%. Those 20% are the diehards. They are the ones that would give everything to the cause. They would give their life. It doesn't matter about truth, right? It's about conviction. But from that remaining 20% is where the seed is grown. And history will show that the downtrodden, those that resist even passively to issues and to problems, the other people look upon them and they say, well, they must have a form of truth. We will follow them. So that becomes very hard to destroy. And this is what Constantine found. So he amalgamated Christianity with paganism. So that way, who is the enemy? And then they made Sunday a day of plenty, a day of celebration. But God's true Sabbath, the Saturday, becomes a boring day, and everyone starts swinging over to the Sunday, till eventually Sunday becomes the day most preferred. And we find that in history. We find that the reason why Constantine brought that in, and the same with other people, other minorities that are persecuted, is that when you really try to destroy them, they end up finding that others just line up in their place. So it's easier to compromise and join with them and change them from within. So, but the government stopped at the 80 and didn't push it further. But that's behavioural science, which will go further later on. The third one that they use is what's called Asch conformity, A-S-C-H, Asch conformity. And it was a real study. It's an interesting study. And let's supposing you have 10 people and you have one person which is the victim, and he's the test subject. And what they do is they draw a line on a board, and then they draw 4 other lines, and they're of different length, but only one of them is the same length as the sample given. So the first 4 would turn around and say, for argument's sake, it's A that they would say, but C is the real one that they should be choosing. They set him up, And then he turns around and says, well, no, it's C. He stands to his guns. And then the others will turn around and say, no, it's A. And this test would be done three or 4 times before the actual test subject just goes along with the crowd. So remember the old saying where it says, if the crowd is going in one direction, well, you should actually run away. But Asch conformity shows us that after a while, the resistance becomes lost and they just go along with it. And this was tried many times, and we do see that in society through the media and through the government and corporations. They turn a lie into a truth, their truth, to convince everyone else that they should be moving in a certain direction or doing a certain thing. And so what is generally believed to be a lie becomes accepted as truth. And I think if people reflect on their experiences, perhaps they can identify with that. An example would be really a long example from the early 1900s, which would be Darwinism, the evolution theory, and where it starts off as a theory, and then the media and the government start saying it's all fact, when it's actually a load of rubbish. It's up to you. You should study what you believe, look at the real science, and even in science there's a false science, and you've got to look at who pays those people to come up with what they determine to be true. So a person must think for themselves, and so whether it be 80-20 rule, Asch conformity, think for yourself. Be responsible for yourself. Right? Don't follow the crowd. Often the crowd in history is wrong. And the last one, of course, is the government really just lies to you about everything, or mixture of truth and lies. But once you have lies with truth, you still have a lie. And that's the way it is. But the real topic of this conversation is actually about the so-called Christian world, really about the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And in Proverbs chapter 10, verse 5, it says, "He that gathereth in summer is a wise son, but he that sleepeth in harvest is a son that causeth shame." This is about God's people and the work they have to do. Just as Proverbs chapter 9 speaks of the wise man who seeks wisdom, knowledge and understanding from the Lord, but the foolish drinketh stolen waters, and bread eaten in secret. In other words, the foolish have a form of truth and abide in that truth, thinking that they are doing God's will, not knowing that they themselves walk on the wrong path. Now that really applies to all religions and all peoples, where we must determine what is truth and what is required of us from God. So a person must seek truth. Now, the SDA, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the original Seventh-day Adventist Church, is the holders of truth. Their doctrines you'll find very hard to refute. Whereas the so-called Protestants of today, we can find that their doctrines are easily refuted. A person just needs to study for themselves, study which Bible it is that you should be reading. Understand that this world is full of deception and deceit. But what happens if you are a holder of truth? What happens if you have the knowledge of truth? Well, it's something you've got to share. It's something that you show unto others. You cannot keep to yourself. If you go to a church and you worship and you go home, but you don't tell your neighbour, if you don't tell your work colleagues, if you don't tell your customers that you have, if you don't tell your friends, if you don't tell your family, then what good are you? Many of us fear being rebuked. We fear that we may be wrong in the things that we believe. Well, they're just natural things, natural thoughts. If we are wrong, then we ought to be open enough to allow ourselves to be corrected. But if we are true in what we believe, then though the heavens fall, we will stand where we are. And so that's the essence of what a true Christian should be. They should be open enough to be able to know the difference between truth and error. They ought to know the difference between their own righteousness and the righteousness of God. Often we seem to validate the things that we do to give ourselves a form of righteousness. But within ourselves is nothing inherent but sin. Our very thoughts deceive us, and our works that we do are often all about self more than the things of God. But let's supposing we kept all the commandments of God. Can we use the commandments of God to say that we are righteous in His eyes? And the answer is no, because that is works. So what is faith? Faith is trusting in God, believing in God. There's nothing else that you have to offer. But through faith, we offer obedience to His law. We show through His law, in obedience to it, that we trust Him. But if we willingly disobey His law, we put ourselves in our own self-righteousness. So, I know this subject that we're talking about is multi-layered. I know that I'm going from one subject to another and I'm not really sticking fully on topic, but giving a broad overall explanation of what a person must be. But the overall theme is study for yourselves what is truth and what you must do to belong to God. How do you test if someone comes to you whether they have truth? You've got to study. How do you know if you are to keep the commandments of God? If the Sabbath, which is Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, is the true day that you are to keep? Well, you must study. Now, many a person in the past have died for truth, died for the principles of truth, just like the principles of law. There has to be credence by their actions, and of course many would say, well, many have died for a false truth, and that is true. But a person must know what they believe at the end of the day. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, in over 20 years, not one has come round to my door. The Jehovah Witnesses, they come here more often. But how do you judge what is truth? You got to study the words of truth, and you ought to also ask God, because you can have all the knowledge of truth, but if you don't have God, you've got nothing. So, the atheist knows more about the gospel than the so-called true Christian. Does it make the atheist belong to God? No. Lucifer knows more about the words of truth than you and I. Does it mean he belongs to God? Definitely not. So a person must yield themselves to God and say, Lord, teach me your ways and your truth. They must surrender all. They must die to themselves and live to Christ. That's what a person must do. And then through obedience, through faith and trust in God and His righteousness, live by His law. So that means study what His law is. All right? What is required of you, what is required of me. Nothing more. But once you're given that light, how do you increase your faith? How do you turn around and profess trust in God and being able to show others that you trust in God, and that is the right path in which a person must walk? There's always errors. We all have errors. But we all got to be teachable. Not only are we to teach, but we are to learn and listen from others. So, but you don't hide. You've got to stand and talk to others. You've got to find your voice in others. And you'll be surprised how many people turn around and say, geez, I've been thinking about that myself. It's people see the wars coming, they see the trouble coming, they see pestilence, they see that, well, not many see, but there is a war against food, and there's the powers that be are controlling the climate. If you ever notice, they do cloud seeding. Well, that cloud seeding, part of its element is uranium, which is not good for us. So we're in a battle all of our own, but we need to share truth with others to grow in faith. And we need to be observant of the things that are happening around us. That is definitely true. I mean, a person, if they have truth inside of them, they have to share it. It's their duty before God. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the one that holds, well, the traditional Seventh-day Adventist Church is the one that is the holder of truth. But they're not preaching the truth. They're not going out telling others the truth. They're keeping it within themselves. There's only a few that are teaching others. And that's a huge issue, because God's going to sweep the floor. God is sorting out those that are His and those that do not belong. Plain and simple. But God gives a command, and He says that those that really belong to Him are to teach others. They're to be a light upon the hill. Israel, the Hebrew nation, is a great example of that. They were chosen by God to teach the Gentiles the mercies of God, the grace of God, the righteousness of God. But they saw the Gentiles to be nothing more than wild dogs, and they would hold truth from them. So, and then they created their own laws. They looked at themselves for their own righteousness, till eventually Jesus comes along and He sets the whole thing straight. And He shows the mercies of God, that first a person must have faith, and then through faith they're obedient to His laws. Not that the laws will give them any form of righteousness, which it will not, because God's righteousness is far higher than us. But because they rejected Christ and put Him upon the cross, they were rejected as a nation before God, as a nation. So the truth goes to the Gentiles, where His laws are written upon the heart of the individual. And so it is the Gentiles that are the holders of truth, which is in turn to make the Jewish people jealous. That's the whole aim of it. And we see a lot of Jews becoming Messianic Jews that are looking towards Christ. Because a person says they're a Christian doesn't mean they have Christ. You know, the gospel talks about a narrow road. And a person must ask themselves, well, how narrow is this road? What is required of me to walk upon this narrow road? And you find that there's nothing about you that you can do except have faith in Christ and be obedient to Him. There's nothing else you can do, but it is a fine line. You cannot look at things through a carnal mind, but a spiritual mind. God is spirit. His words are spirit. We cannot turn around and say, well, I don't steal from my neighbour. I preach the truth to the poor and to those that are willing to hear. You know, I do not steal. I do not covet my neighbour's things. Well, they're the things that we are to be obedient to, but that will not save us. That will nowhere near get us to belong to God. So, but we do them because we trust God, and we don't look at ourselves, our own righteousness before God, because there is not. So, you know, I guess that's about it for now. I could go on. But first YouTube, dude, and really hard to know what to say, to be honest. A person can prepare, but the words don't really come out the way you want them to flow. And that's the way it goes. That's life. So anyway, good luck. I don't know if I'll do another. But understand what's coming. There's a big deceit coming. You have... Well, I'll carry on a little bit more. Why the hell not? We've got all your Eastern religions looking for their Messiah. And no matter who the Messiah is, they're all looking for it. You got the so-called Christian world, they're looking for several things. They're looking for the rapture. Another thing, study for yourself. That's Jesuit theatre. It's a load of rubbish. It's a lie. The second thing they're looking for is the Antichrist. And they say the third temple, where the Antichrist will come. Another Jesuit theatre lie. It's a load of rubbish. It's swallowed by the so-called Protestant church. Then the third thing that they're looking for is the second coming of Christ. But what is to come next? Well, it's Lucifer appearing as Christ. That is the next major prophetic event. And the fallen angels will appear as the deities of the East, as well as prominent men and women of the past, even your own family members. Now they will all turn around and say that God's day has been changed to Saturday to Sunday, which is more lies, right? And then you have the so-called UFOs. Well, man's always looking for elsewhere, and the fallen angels can appear as these entities. And so they're, apparently from my research, they're going to appear on the scenes within a couple of years. So they're all going to point to this false Christ, which is Lucifer. And so the world's going to follow. The Bible talks about the world killing God's people, thinking that they're doing God's will. Well, what would give the world so much hate and so much belief that they're killing true Christians, thinking they're doing God's will? There has to be a great deceit and a great deception coming along. And so you've got Bible prophecy, and you've got all these other things coming together. So the next thing is not just Sunday worship by law or Sunday rest by law, but also Satan appearing as Christ. That can be the only great deception that is to occur. Now this one about the third temple, well, the Antichrist was already around even in the Apostles' days. Even Apostle Paul spoke of it, that the Spirit was already there. But he that which is to be removed has to be removed before this other beast, this Antichrist, comes on the scene. And that beast was the Roman Empire. It had to be removed. And when it was removed, there was a little horn that grew very stout, more than his others, and that was Papal Rome. That is the Antichrist. That is the seat of Satan. And you can see the whole world following after this beast. You can see between America and the Vatican that even their buildings are very much similar and the same. And you can see so-called Protestant America bringing church and state together. Or just study your Dark Ages, 538 to 1798. Have a look at Mussolini on the Lateran Pact of 1929. And have a look at 1610 in the town of Virginia in America. And look at 1888 in Washington, where Sunday rest by law, and people were jailed, put on the chain gang. So when you see them talking about church and state, just look at your history. And through history you can see that it leads only to tyranny, leads to persecution of all those that want independent thought. And it also decreases technology. I mean, that's one of the things they don't want you to have, is not just expression of thought, but they want you as the individual to be stymied in your ability to create. Now, we as humans, we do want to create. We want to problem solve and we want to better our lives. But church and state will not do that for you. It gives you a form of righteousness at first, but when enacted, it just gives tyranny and persecution and leads to death. Have a look at France in the Age of Reason. It's another example of church and state coming together, so to speak. Because even in the Church of Reason, they presented a woman, did they not? And say, this is your goddess. So whether or not they want to discard religion, there becomes a form of religion in the end. And but the fruits of it are nothing but sorrow. And this is where we're moving. The great deception will soon be upon us. Even if we look at the Sabbath, when God created the heavens and the earth, on the seventh day he rested. He created everything within 6 days, but the gospel uses that as a timeline. Between the sin of Adam and the death of Christ is around 4,000 years. And between death of Christ and now is another 2,000. Well, we're coming up to it, so that leads to around 6,000 years. But God rested on the 7th. So how soon before Jesus comes? Well, obviously he's going to come after Satan comes to put things right. So it's only a short period of time before these things come to play. Anyway, wishing you all well. Goodbye.